There
All
we go.
right. Well, how about we just go on and get started? I know some folks are making their way in, but let's just get started. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to Dr. Mack's first meeting of 2025. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday season. And today's meeting is one of Dr. Mack's educational offerings. We will be learning how to better support the BIPOC community from BIPOC Alliance and get an update from RTD on their Title VI program policy changes. We are so excited to share these resources with you and hope you learn something alongside us. As usual, Steph will begin the meeting by reminding us all of our mission and addressing some Zoom housekeeping.
Thanks, Colleen. For those of you who are new to our meetings, welcome. We wanted to share our mission at the beginning of each meeting just to remind ourselves the lens at which we look through. So Dr. Mack takes a multi-level approach to inform and empower people to overcome mobility barriers through education, collaboration, and advocacy to overall just enhance the quality of life. So each of our meetings focus on a different aspect, and today's is all about education and advocacy. So if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and type your name and organization into the chat. If you've been to one of our meetings before, you know the deal, but we kindly ask that everyone stay muted unless you're speaking. Please feel free to use the chat as needed for questions, comments, whatever. And you can also use the raise your hand function to be called on if you have something to add. So with that covered, let's go ahead and move on to some staff introductions from the Dr. Mack team, along with some updates. So I'll go ahead and get us started here. So hi, I'm Stephanie O'Neill. I am the program manager of special projects here. I oversee our travel training program as well as a couple of others. And we are nearing the point where we will be announcing the date for our first technology training class that we're hosting. So stay posted for that. But yeah, excited to share that with you all. Latoya.
Thanks, Steph. My name is Latoya Pranti. I'm the Operations Development Manager. For those who don't know me, for everybody else, hi again. Just a little quick update. We are on a few college platforms for internships. So not only are we always taking volunteers that we appreciate, which we have a couple here online with us today, but we also are accepting interns from DU, CU, Denver, Metro, and Regis. So that's my update, and I'm excited about that. So there it is, Malia.
Sorry about that. Let me go back one slide. Hi, everyone. I'm Malia Munson. I am the Administrative Project Coordinator at Dr. Mack. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about membership and remind everybody that as we step into this new year, it's the perfect time to renew or begin a membership with Dr. Mack if you don't already have one. Your support as a member ensures we can continue connecting our communities and improving access to transportation. We want to serve those who rely on our resources the most. So join us in 2025 and hopefully we can make an even greater impact than we have in previous years. Maria?
Thank you, Malia. My name is Maria Griffin, and I support Dr. Mack as a bilingual administrative and marketing coordinator. I'm also one of the voices you will hear when you call our INA. And as always, I am happy to connect all our clients with the transportation resources that they need, and also connecting with new transit resources to our 2-hour guide as well. Please follow us on social media. Valeria?
Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. My name is Valeria Martinez. I am the bilingual program and training assistant. I am seeing tons of awesome organizations across the state. So please feel free to reach out to me or anyone on the team. If you are looking for trainings, we are also really open and flexible to adjusting our content to meet the needs of your communities, specifically within the BIPOC communities and refugee communities. We really want to partner with you all. You guys are the grassroots organizations that are directly serving people. And so we really want to connect and make sure that we are tailoring our trainings to what our community members need. So yeah, I'm excited to be here with you all and Happy New Year again. Handing it over to Arthur.
Hi, everyone. I'm Arthur. I'm the Outreach and Development Coordinator. Currently, what we've been working on is reaching out to some communities that we've been doing less good at reaching out to and providing our free education services. Right now, specifically, we are looking at reaching out to schools to provide better training options for there. And if you have any contacts in that direction, or if you know anyone, you can always reach out to me, and we can make that happen if you have any ideas yourself. So, thank you. That was everyone, right? Did I miss someone?
Alrighty, we are really excited to have our first speaker, India Phoenix. So she and they are coming from the BIPOC Alliance. Their organization's mission is to unite to cultivate spaces of joy, healing, and liberation for people of color, advocating for our power and autonomy. So India, go ahead and take it away. Please share a little bit more about yourself, and we are open to learning from you. Thank you for being here with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I am going to send a request to share my screen so that I can pull up some slides. But while I do that, hello, my name is India Phoenix. I am the Director of Programs and Culture at the BIPOC Alliance. We are based out of Fort Collins up here, and we serve, as was mentioned, we serve the BIPOC community. To create and cultivate spaces of joy, healing, and liberation. Sorry, I'm trying to get my screen up. Create spaces of joy, healing, and liberation for communities of color to advance our autonomy and our collective power. So we were invited to just share a little bit about what the BIPOC experience is. Thank you so much for having us. I want to start by just acknowledging something that I believe everyone in this room, I'm sure, can agree and understand, and that is that transportation is a right. When we're working specifically with the BIPOC community, I think oftentimes we view these things, certain things for others, as a right and a privilege for communities of color and other marginalized communities. So wanting to start with that. So as I mentioned, our organization has the mission to cultivate spaces of joy, healing, and liberation. And we have this vision of a decolonized community rooted in ancestral wisdom, shared resources, and authentic connections, abundant in joy. We do a lot of work in the BIPOC community in various different ways. So we offer healing, different spaces for community circles and healing for communities of color. We also provide opportunities for joy. We do different community celebrations, such as our Dia de Muertos celebration up in Fort Collins, our Juneteenth celebration. We do serve primarily the Larimer County, Weld County region, although we have done some work further south into Boulder and Denver as well. But that is a little bit about who we are. And the work that we do is to really promote equity and autonomy for communities of color, to decolonize systems that are designed to oppress marginalized groups, and then to challenge the stereotypes about the BIPOC experience. That last one is where we spend a lot of our time. Oftentimes when people reach out to the BIPOC community, they tend to lump BIPOC and low income into one group, and that is just simply not true. They also tend to lump BIPOC with underprivileged and just disempowering language that is just not representative of the BIPOC experience. The BIPOC community is not a monolith. We represent a multitude of intersectionalities, and something that we really aim to really promote throughout the community is just that the BIPOC experience is that of one which is varied and really runs the gamut of experience. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about the BIPOC experience in terms of transportation. I did do quite a little bit of research ahead of this presentation just to understand the context of what the experience, particularly in our area of Northern Colorado, has been like for the BIPOC community in regards to access to transportation. So for a little bit of historical context, one thing that is very well known, or at least in the BIPOC communities, I'm not sure how much you guys all know about redlining and the ways in which that has very much so heavily impacted the BIPOC community. This is something that happened in Denver. I was just talking to my boyfriend about 5 points, and he was giving me a breakdown of the 5 points light rail system and all of the ways in which it has been failing the community. So one of the things that we think of when we think about redlining is not only do Black and Brown communities get sanctioned off into areas that then become historically have become food deserts, have historically been lack of good schooling options and lack of mobility within those spaces, but then the systems, of course, then don't invest. So not only are we seeing Black and Brown communities in de facto segregation, but we're also seeing then an underinvestment from the public transit system to benefit those communities. As my team and I were preparing for this, we couldn't help but notice how poor our transportation systems are outside of the urban landscape, despite our high number of BIPOC community members. Up in Fort Collins, we have a big population up in the north side of town, but our transportation options are very limited to that north side of town. So that's one example of redlining in action and the ways in which it really hinders our communities. Additionally, the way in which highway development has then moved us away. So de facto segregation, pushing Black and Brown people into communities where they have lack of access to resources and then lack of access to transportation. This is not just historical. Obviously, this applies to our modern landscape as well. So I alluded to the lack of RTD services in BIPOC neighborhoods, the disproportionate exposures as the city chooses to expand and grow. They do so in a way that harms BIPOC communities and cuts off access for BIPOC communities to get to higher end and newer developing neighborhoods. And one thing that I want to acknowledge, as I sort of mentioned at the top of this all, is that as we are talking about the BIPOC experience in terms of transportation, once again, acknowledging that this is not a monolith, right? So a lot of what I am referencing does impact lower income communities. That is not the exclusive identity of the BIPOC community. So something that often gets asked of us with the best of intentions is how can we market and outreach to the BIPOC community? And my caveat to that is to say that the BIPOC community is very expansive, so we must really understand what we're saying and who we're talking about, and how we can expand our language and our understanding, right? So when we say access to the BIPOC community, I want to really expand your thinking of where the BIPOC community lives. And if you are saying lower income, then how are we servicing BIPOC community members who have lower incomes, right? And who are coming from that. So minding that intersectionality in language, language really matters and it's important. The ways in which we talk about our communities, especially when addressing youth, we tend to inadvertently use that language that is very disempowering. So wanting to acknowledge that in asking us to speak here, we are speaking about the BIPOC experience and we want to expand beyond the idea that BIPOC is equivalent to poverty. Not saying that that's what anyone in this space is doing, but just naming that. And then lastly, a huge piece of the BIPOC experience and the work that we do is to advocate for communities of color in spaces of autonomy. Nope, you're fine. I just want to make sure I left space if anyone had anything, but I wanted to just name that focus on structural inequities within the system. So a huge arm of the work that we do as the BIPOC Alliance is to advocate for communities of color in spaces that they cannot always be, and to make sure that their voices are heard as we address structural inequities. So in doing so, what does this look like in action? Centering equity in action looks like decolonizing advocacy. So as we are talking with communities of color, what is so important is to bring voices of communities of color to the center of the conversation. How are we amplifying the impacted voices of the communities that we're hoping to reach, and also recognizing their expertise? So a perfect example is bringing us in to talk about these things and about our experience. So thank you so much for really living that value out, but allowing for the community experts to share their experience and lead the charge. In doing this, oftentimes in advocacy spaces, what tends to happen is that people say they speak for the BIPOC community without having much BIPOC representation. And not getting the full gamut of the experience of the BIPOC community. So really having your ear to the ground as much as possible, and then partnering with organizations such as the BIPOC Alliance to bridge those gaps when you do have gaps in community connections, to allow for the actual community impacted to share their story. So that's, of course, how we would think about reaching out in advocacy. But as we think about the infrastructure, of course, we want to make sure that for the BIPOC community that there is reliable and affordable public transportation. And something that came up as we prepared is really, how are we creating accessibility for our elders? How are we creating accessibility for those who are differently abled? And how does that look outside of our traditional notions of public transit? So what does walkability within certain cities look like? I know that up north, that is a huge problem. In smaller cities like Fort Collins, we don't have as much walkability, and that really is a disadvantage for our community to get around. The addition of bike lanes and multimodal transit. Another really awesome initiative that is happening up here is we have a rideshare co-op that has been developed that is really the community's answer to Uber, in a way that prioritizes the drivers, many of whom come from immigrant communities and communities of color, so that they maintain most of their fee for doing the transportation. I believe the Uber rate, I can't, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, but it's 20% is what Uber drivers walk away with from their fee. Our co-op is closer to 80% that the drivers are getting from that fee. And then all the remaining, that 20% administrative fee, is just going to maintaining the app. So something run for the people, by the people, created by the communities impacted. So that would be, if there's anything you take away from my spiel today, is that really getting the community that is impacted involved in the problem solving and the solution making is going to be that much better. We can, of course, prescribe many things for the community, but without hearing what the community needs, we are going to miss the mark. And so this app, I know, has been developed over the last year or so, with lots of community feedback, lots of rounds of development, and really trying to amplify the driver experience over a corporate entity. And then lastly, this is sort of leading into that, sort of what I've been acknowledging this whole time, is that collaboration is a huge piece of the work that we do. At the BIPOC Alliance, we have a lot of partnerships with other organizations such as yourself, where we are sort of that voice, right? So thinking about amplifying the voice of impacted communities, we are that liaison. We are able to help bridge the gap between organizations and communities of color in a way that is equitable. Communities of color operate at the speed of trust. And so oftentimes it can be very difficult for organizations to get into these communities to make the impact that they desire to make. And so we hope to be a little bit of a bridge for that in supporting different organizations. And then another piece that is so important whenever I work with nonprofits and just the public sector in general, is to make sure that you are partnering with organizations who have their boots on the ground. There are a lot of community efforts led by the BIPOC community already in place. And so especially when funding is concerned, bringing these organizations in, using their expertise and helping to amplify the work that they are doing rather than to compete with them, is a massive support for BIPOC community, and a way to really respond to structural inequity. BIPOC organizations tend to be smaller. They tend to have less manpower, and therefore they miss out on several funding opportunities. So being able to bring along those organizations on projects that you're working on to ensure that community component is very important. BIPOC Alliance is always happy to be that resource and also to connect with other organizations that are doing some of this work as well. And then as we kind of think about, wrapping it up with what does action actually look like? A lot of this is what I talked about. I mentioned again the community rideshare programs. My team told me the name of it before I got on this call, and of course I've already forgotten. But I will do my best to send a follow-up email with what the name of that organization is called. But it's not the only of its kind. There are others. But these community-based rideshare programs just put the hands or into the power of the people, and that's really important in advancing equity for our communities. Public advocacy is another really, or policy advocacy is another really great way to work with our community. We have a group called the Local Government Accountability Organization, and we work directly with different officials at the local, state, and then national level to really advance equity for communities of color. Something that we are working on in Fort Collins and up in Larimer County is the budget. And making sure that there is built-in space for communities of color to be considered through that budget, and just advocating in those spaces during our city council meetings. That is incredibly important. Just making sure that the people who are making the decisions are really considering our communities. And then also anti-discrimination policies, in terms of how the transit system works. So as I was researching for this, noting that there have been some racist remarks within the RTD and how the response time is built in, and then also what kind of training is offered at an institutional level. And then lastly, thinking about action in what we are doing right now, creating spaces where there are workshops to talk about what transit equity can look like. And then fostering allyship for comprehensive systems that can work together. So I would love to offer BIPOC Alliance as a resource to any organization that is here. We have our goal of advancing equity, and we are here to be a partner to any organization that hopes to amplify the BIPOC experience and the BIPOC voice. And we are happy to partner in any capacity in that way. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we do and how we hope to see you connect in. Oh, thank you so much, Colleen, for naming that. I always assume people know what BIPOC means, but BIPOC does stand for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And so this is sort of your role. For those of you who are not, you're not familiar with that, I apologize for just taking over with my acronyms. But what does that look like for you and your organization? So addressing historical inequities is incredibly important. As we mentioned, redlining and different access to transportation. Something that comes up a lot when I work with different community organizations is they will host an event and then they will not consider transportation barriers. They will not consider how people will get to them. They will not consider those resources, and that's incredibly important. So as a system within your power, how can you address historical inequities in connecting with the community? I've talked a lot about this, so hopefully it was well received in that recognizing intersectionality. The BIPOC community is not a monolith. We do not share all the same experiences. And it's very important to not put us into a box. So I always say BIPOC does not equal poor. The reason that people tend to have that notion is because of historical inequities and systemic oppression. That was done entirely by design, and organizations like mine exist to change that narrative. Another way that you can support our organization and organizations like us is to just advocate for, fund, and amplify BIPOC initiatives. So I mentioned at the top of this, really not fighting for funding. We see this so often. Well-intending orgs have an idea to do a BIPOC initiative, and because they have more manpower, because they have more resources, they are able to get that done more quickly, whereas BIPOC organizations tend to have had these initiatives run for quite some time and have a lot more community buy-in. So it's it's going to make your job harder. But B, it's going to take away funding from the community organizations that really can benefit and are doing the work and have been doing the work. So rather, can you build partnerships with organizations like this organization, like our organization, to support these equitable solutions? We would love, love, love to support you. And then lastly, I always say this because I feel like whenever I get on a call, whenever I share about this organization, it sounds like it's a lot of work. And it is top heavy, and I never want it to seem like I am accusatory, because that is not even close to what it is. Right, this is a marathon. Working on what's the word I'm looking for? Dismantling structural oppression is a long job. These systems took years and years and years to build. And so we are working our best to dismantle them. And so the best way to do that is to stay informed, stay engaged, and amplify communities of color and our voices whenever possible. We are always happy to partner. It is not offensive to be asked. We love it. We love opportunities to do that. I think sometimes people are afraid. Please don't be. I'm giving permission, at least for BIPOC Alliance. I answer the email, so all is good if you all reach out to me. I'm so happy for that. And then, yeah, I can stop sharing my screen. I would love to just, I don't know how much time I have left, but just open up any questions for how I can support you all.
It looks like Andrea has her hand up. Andrea, go ahead.
Just a quick question, India. If you put your email in the chat so we can get in touch with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, India, for your time and the research. I know your work is really broad, and especially when we add that lens of transportation, it added an extra layer of research for you. So thank you so much for putting in that effort and really shining light on how much collaboration is truly needed for this work to really be accessible for many groups. Even in Denver, we still struggle with access to transportation. And so, what you mirrored up north is mirrored down here in Denver because of the intersectionality. So thank you so much I just want to say thank you for the effort and being here today. And would love to open it up for anyone else that has any questions for India.
Thank you, India. It's not really a question, but I would love to connect with you about the transit app and the transit resources available for newcomers. I will be connecting with you regarding that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Happy to help.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yes, thank you for your presentation, India. Very informative. I actually at my department in RTD, we house our non-discrimination our RTD non-discrimination policy, which essentially it covers one of the remarks that you said, where you've been hearing a lot of racist remarks. I'd love to touch base with you, to see how we can come up with a solution for that in the future, whether
Absolutely.
it's training or something like that. So yeah, please send me your email, and we can get in touch.
Absolutely. And I threw my email in the chat for anyone who's interested. A huge part of the work that BIPOC Alliance does is to offer trainings like this to different community organizations. So happy to bring something similar, more tailored for any of your organizations. If anyone would like to reach out to us, we are happy to provide that. Thank you all. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, India. Our next speaker is
Danny had a
Martin.
question.
Oh, sorry, Danny.
I just did like a little clap icon. So wonderful job. That's my question.
Thank you for that. Our next speaker is Martin Romero from RTD, who will be giving us an update on RTD Title VI program update policy changes that directly affect the communities discussed in this meeting. Martin?
Yes, thank you. And okay, perfect. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin Romero. I serve as the Transit Equity Manager with RTD. And today with me, also presenting, I have Transit Equity Specialist Danny McLean and Lorena Gonzalez. So first of all, I want to thank Dr. Mack for allowing us this space to present today. And to give you a little bit of context before we start, we, RTD's Transit Equity Office, are in the process of updating our Title VI program. And so as implied, the Title VI program comes with many updates, but today we want to cover our 2025 Civil Rights Title VI proposed policy changes, which we will cover in detail during this presentation. As a heads up, we will be pausing a few times during the presentation in hopes of collecting some feedback on the proposed policies. And yeah, let's get started. So I will go ahead and pass it to Lorena now.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you here today. I want to start by giving an overview of our presentation. So we'll start with our meeting objectives, why we're here, what we're hoping to do. We'll then provide an overview of the Civil Rights Act Title VI requirements, which guides the work that our team manages. We'll get into RTD's 3 new proposed policy changes, which are the major service change policy, the low income definition, and the fair equity policy. And like Martin mentioned, each policy will be followed by a brief Q&A, and we'll wrap with a closing Q&A. Next slide, please. Okay, so jumping into our objectives. So we hope that you walk away with a better understanding of the Title VI requirements under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And together we'll explore the Title VI program's purpose and key parts, and examine the proposed changes to the 3 Title VI policies. And ultimately, we're here to hear your feedback on these policy changes or other ideas you may have. Next slide, please. All right, so jumping into the requirements overview of the Title VI Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so we can't talk about this critical piece of legislation without talking about the pivotal figures of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. So many of us know that Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in Alabama sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. Dr. King's leadership during this boycott and his advocacy for racial and economic and income equality and the labor of countless other leaders helped dismantle segregation and laid the foundation for legislation like the Civil Rights Act, transforming their freedom struggle into enduring legal protections. And so the Civil Rights Act says that no one in the United States can be excluded, denied benefits, or discriminated against in any program or activity that gets federal funding because of their race, color, or national origin, which includes languages spoken beyond English. Next slide, please. And so we just covered what the Civil Rights Act requires. I now want to walk you through the Title VI Civil Rights and Transit Equity goals, which we see as the why behind meeting these requirements at RTD. So first, we'll be talking a lot about equity in this presentation. So we should make sure that everybody knows what equity means. At RTD, equity is about making sure that everyone, people of different races, colors, people who speak different languages, etc., are treated fairly and justly, and that transit benefits and burdens are shared fairly, recognizing that some groups have faced and continue to face more oppression or less social benefits than others. Another goal is fair distribution of transit services, meaning everyone should have access to transit that meets their needs, especially communities that have been underserved. The third goal is full, fair participation in public transportation decision-making. So we need to hear from everyone, especially those who rely on transit, so decisions reflect the needs of all, not just a few. The fourth is meaningful access to transit-related programs for linguistically diverse populations, meaning that language should never be a barrier to understanding or using transit programs. And then finally, the important goal of ensuring people of color and low-income customers are not unfairly affected by agency-level decisions or projects. And we, must acknowledge that there's much more to be done on this front, to India's point in the prior presentation. Next slide, please. So now that we've grounded ourselves in the Civil Rights Act and the goals that RTD has developed to meet those requirements, let's discuss the specific ways in which our Transit Equity Office puts those into practice to comply with Title VI regulations. So every 3 years, RTD is required by the Federal Transit Administration to submit a Title VI civil rights program that follows a set of guidelines they have outlined as a condition to receiving ongoing federal funds. And this ensures that transit agencies adhere to federal civil rights regulations. So to meet these requirements, RTD's Title VI program is a comprehensive approach that includes policy, standards, and analysis to assure that public transportation service decisions are equitable and inclusive. And we do this by conducting equity analyses on things like major service changes or the construction of maintenance facilities, for example. And then we also conduct service monitoring for equitable service delivery and prioritize community engagement to hear how we can make transit more equitable through our public participation and language access plans. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to give you an overview of sort of our North Star, the goals that come from that. And then we are going to dive into the policies. Before we do that, does anyone have any clarifying questions or any comments they want to add? Andrea.
I'm just curious because I don't know if Denver has an area where indigenous people are kind of concentrated, like 5 Points tends to have a lot of Black population. I know Boulder has a huge Russian population. Is there a place in Denver that has an indigenous population, or are they fairly spread out?
I'm going to ask my colleagues Martin or Danny to jump in. I'm about a month into the team.
I mean, to my awareness, I don't think there's a concentration in Denver. There might be. I'm not aware of it, but it'd be good to pull some data on it to see where they where they reside.
I wonder if anybody else here in the meeting might have that kind of information.
But I do know that like the 5 Points is no longer predominantly Black, so there's been a shift in the demographics in communities. So I'm sure there has to be some kind of study somewhere, Andrea. I can help see if I can find something.
Yeah, and I would say too, so the data source that we rely on quite a lot for RTD's work is the US Census, specifically the 5-year estimate from the American Community Survey. And that includes, race, ethnicity, and other demographic factors. So that would be a really good source to pull this information. I would say that RTD specifically doesn't focus in on Indigenous populations, right? As India was saying, we unfortunately tend to group with BIPOC, but I think it would be very useful for us to look more into where those populations reside.
It would be useful to know if there is some location that really is not getting served. You know about the other populations, but indigenous is another issue. That's it. That's all I was asking.
Thank you for that question. Any other questions or comments from anyone else in the room? Alrighty. Well, feel free to pop any questions into the chat, or we'll circle back to more Q&A time at the end of our presentation. I'll pass it over to Danny for our next slides.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lorena. So as Martin mentioned, my name is Danny McLean. I serve as Transit Equity Specialist in the Civil Rights Division at RTD. And I'm going to kick off this section focused in on the policy changes that we are recommending as part of our, upcoming updated Title VI program. And there's 3 policies specifically. So we'll be talking about what we're proposing to change about our major service change policy, redefining what low income means under Title VI regulations at the agency, as well as some updates to our fair equity policy. So if we can move to the next slide, let's kick it off with the major service change policy and how we propose to change that. So as I'm sure many folks in the room are familiar with, RTD undergoes service changes somewhat frequently. So they typically occur 3 times a year in January, the early summer period, and September. And the stated goal of service changes is to essentially improve the system, right? So improving on-time performance, accounting for changes in ridership. Perhaps, there's more riders on the W line, and so they increase frequency. Or otherwise to meet the goals of the RTD system optimization plan. Can we go back 1 slide, please? And so service changes happen 3 times a year, and most recently we instated categories. There's 5 categories, and this was to better support the community in understanding the service change process, and importantly to facilitate feedback and input on those service changes. So those categories are a route adjustment, a seasonal adjustment, service increase and service reduction, and schedule timing. So route adjustment, for instance, could be perhaps a stop gets moved, right? A bus stop gets moved. That could be a route adjustment. A seasonal adjustment is something that's typically due to temporal factors. So for instance, there tend to be seasonal adjustments primarily between summer and fall when school comes back online. And service increase, for instance, an increase in frequency, maybe a 15-minute route goes to a 30-minute, or the opposite, a service reduction. Maybe a 30-minute frequency route goes to a 15-minute. I think I maybe inverted those. You know what I mean? And then schedule timing, which tends to be, very slight changes in schedule to improve that on-time performance. Next slide, please. So what you may not know is that behind the scenes and part of the service change policy, and something that we have to present to the board every single time that there are service changes, we have a major service change policy, and this is a requirement of the Federal Transit Administration. So effectively, the FTA requires transit providers like RTD to evaluate the impacts of proposed service changes that qualify as a major service change on BIPOC communities compared to non-BIPOC communities, and low-income communities compared to non-low-income communities. And I really want to honor what India was saying prior about convoluting these groups. When we do these evaluations, these analyses, they're not conflated. They're separate examinations between BIPOC, non-BIPOC, and low-income and non-low-income. And so what's interesting about this requirement from the FTA is that the transit provider itself, so RTD, we define what a major service change means to us, right? So transit agencies have that leniency to set that policy themselves. So typically this looks like something like a change that affects X% of a route, or perhaps it's the percentage of people that are affected by a service change makes it a major service change, okay? But RTD's current policy, which you can see at the bottom of the screen, how we define what is a major service change is a major service change is a 25% increase or decrease in service hours on a route or line that lasts 12 months or more. So that's the criteria for something that is a major service change, and everything else is not considered a major service change. So some things I want to point out specifically in this policy. Service hours, not everyone knows what this means. So service hours refers to the total time that a vehicle is actively in operation. So this includes revenue hours, right? When the vehicle is actively picking up passengers and perhaps making money from that, and non-revenue hours, such as deadheading. That's service hours. And then importantly, our current policy says that service change has to last 12 months or more to be considered major. So anything under that amount of time is not considered a major service change, and therefore it does not trigger that evaluation of the impacts to BIPOC and low-income communities. Next slide, please. So my team examined about 24 different major service change policies across the nation, and we pulled, best practices and a lot of overlapping criteria in the major service change policies that we were seeing. And essentially what we have crafted is what we hope to be a more robust service change, major service change policy, I should say, that essentially means that RTD will be applying an equity lens to more service changes. So I've recopied the current policy up top so you can compare with the proposed changes. But essentially where we want to move is that a major service change is not just a 25% change in service hours on a change that lasts 12 months or more. Instead, it would include any 25% change in not just service hours, but route miles, service span, and frequency as well. Okay, so service hours remains the same. Route miles is very much, the length of how far a bus route goes. Service span is the span of time. So for example, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then frequency is how many vehicles run, perhaps in an hour. Is it 4 buses an hour? Is it 3 buses an hour? That's frequency. Importantly, another change that we want to propose to the policy is that this would capture any 25% change made in one service proposal or cumulatively, right? So if service development comes forward at RTD and they're proposing that a change, even if it's just 6 months, even if it's just 3 months, if it's a 25% change in, one service proposal, that would trigger the major service change policy, right? Or cumulatively, what this means is perhaps there's lots of small changes that happen over a 3-year period, and it's 5% reduction here, a 10% increase there, and then a 30% reduction. If that adds up to 25%, then that'll trigger a major service change policy. And cumulative impacts are not currently part of our policy. And then finally, it applies to implementation, elimination, or discontinuation of a route or line. So again, the goal of this is to broaden the criteria for these analyses, removing the temporal 12-month minimum, and then including small changes that are made over time that may add up to a 25% change. Next slide, please. So you may be wondering, so what? Like, why does this matter? What's the big deal about a major service change policy? Well, what I alluded to prior is that if there is a service change that is found to be a major service change, then per the FTA, RTD has to examine the impacts on our community members, specifically BIPOC communities versus non-BIPOC communities, and then impacts to low-income communities versus non-low-income communities. And then if an impact is found, then RTD has to either avoid the service change, minimize the impact, or mitigate that impact on BIPOC and low-income communities, right? So essentially, this just allows us to take action to ensure that we are providing our services in a way that's fair, that's equitable, and in an anti-discriminatory manner, right? Notably, this does not necessarily mean that RTD cannot instate a major service change. Okay, so just because something is found to have impact doesn't mean, RTD, you absolutely cannot do this. There is a little bit of leeway. So if RTD has a substantial legitimate justification for implementing the major service change, maintenance, the rail project that's been happening would likely be considered a legitimate justification. And there are no alternatives that would have less impact for RTD to accomplish its goals. RTD can proceed with that change. But I will say, since I've been here the past 3 years, effectively every time we found a major service change that, would impact the community in a grave way, we have taken steps to address that change. One final note I want to say, so a major service change doesn't necessarily have to be a decrease, right? It can also be an increase. So we also want to capture changes where perhaps the benefits are not equally shared, as well as the burden, right? So if we have non-low-income communities and non-BIPOC communities who are disproportionately benefiting from a good thing, then that also is considered a major service change. Next slide, please. let's walk through some visualizations of what this could mean, when applied to actual service changes. So here we have a route adjustment example. So here we have a fictitious route on the left that's 20 miles long. So imagine that service development puts forth a proposal that chops off the last 5 miles of that route. That's a 25% change, so it's considered a major service change. Next slide, please. On the flip side of that, imagine that you have that route, that's 15-mile route to start with, but then we want to add on the five miles at the end. That's actually a 33% increase, which surpasses that 25% threshold. So it's a major service change. Next slide. In the context of span, right? I mentioned service span. So we have a route that runs 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Service development proposes it's now 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. That's a 25% reduction. It would be considered a major service change to be analyzed. Next slide, please. Or the inverse, 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. You increase it to 6 p.m. That's a 33% increase, also a major service change. And then finally, some last examples, frequency. So this is probably one of the more common changes that RTD makes. So imagine you have 4 buses that are running on a 15-minute frequency. You cut that down to 3 buses every 20 minutes. It's a 25% change. Or the inverse, right, which is 3 buses per hour every 20 minutes, increasing to 4. So that's every 15 minutes. It's a 33% increase, also a major service change. Next slide, please. So I know that it's a little technical, and there's lots of details to this that we couldn't unfortunately present on today, including how we calculate the impacts. But this proposed policy language is what we want y'all to focus on, and we really need your input to determine how to proceed. Do we want this new policy? Do we not want this new policy? So please, I beg you, scan the QR code to the right and take the survey, letting us know your thoughts. And then also, I believe my colleagues posted the link in the chat so you can access it there. Otherwise, does anyone have any questions about the content I just presented on the major service change policy?
I think Sarah had a question in the chat regarding access on demand. She was asking if access on demand counts as, or access on demand change would count. I can't speak, I'm sorry. Would that count as a major change? Access on demand will no longer be a 24-hour service in May.
That's an awesome question. So our policies dictate what fixed route services have to do. There's a different set of rules and regulations for paratransit services, from what I understand, and maybe Martin can touch on that. But our work does not adequately capture programs like access on demand, which I feel is a gap. And I will say that's not necessarily RTD's. Well, the FTA has limited guidance, let's say, has limited guidance on how we specifically govern programs like that. But Martin, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, you hit the nail on the head. Really, our current policy doesn't allow for us to do an analysis on access on demand so that we can consider it a major service change. But I can connect with Gabe Christie to see what they're working on that end. I know he's very involved in those discussions. Yeah, I can connect with Gabe Christie and Sarah Lee. I can get back to you on that.
Awesome, Latoya.
Yes, I had a question. So are you saying for some services that you guys completely went away with at one point, let's just say that now this is a huge issue and they definitely need services in this area again, even though at one point it went away? Is that something that is in this that's considered part of this, or how does that work?
Are you referring perhaps to like COVID changes in services?
Yeah, like for an example, Golden.
I know. So this policy would not apply retroactively necessarily, except for the cumulative component, okay? So that would be triggered, like the cumulative aspect of this policy would be triggered when the first change to that service occurs. And at this point with COVID, that's beyond, the 3 years that would be the starting point essentially of this policy if it were to be finalized this summer. Does that answer your question? Okay.
It did. Thank you.
I think we also have another question on the chat from Darla Stewart. How are impacted communities notified of major service changes? Will that outreach include community groups?
Yeah, absolutely. So major service changes are wrapped up into the service change outreach as a whole. So whenever RTD invites feedback on proposed service changes, the major service changes are included in that. And we're working with them to better clarify when those major service changes are flagged as a major service change, because currently they're not really flagged in our process. They're kind of lumped all together. So we're working on with communications on that. And we specifically, our team does outreach on the side to community groups, to community-based organizations who fall within a certain geographic, distance from a router line that's facing a major service change, to let them know directly that that change is happening or is proposed to be happening. I'm sorry. And that folks should, share their voices, right? They should provide input on if they want that change or if they don't want that change. I hope that answers your question, Darla.
To just to add to that a little, we actually just received the public meetings for the May 2025 service changes. I can drop those in the chat after our presentation, and if if you're interested in attending one of those to learn more about our service changes, those would be the meetings to go to. There, we do offer virtual and in-person meetings as well. I think the first one begins the beginning of March, just to kind of give you a time frame.
Colleen?
This is more of well, I guess it's a request, not a question, but going back to Sarah's question about the accessoride, and I know you're going to reach out to, I think you said Gabe Martin, but I think it would be good for whatever you find out, if maybe you could also let us know, because I'm sure we're going to receive some calls asking about once this, once the service changes go out, that's going to be a big question. How will accessoride be affected as well? So I'm just asking that you could probably maybe let us know as soon as you hear something from Gabe.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Colleen, access on demand is different from accessoride.
Right.
So
Right, but she asked about accessoride too. I just didn't mention the access on demand, but I'm sure we'll get calls if the service changes somehow.
Yes, and I just want to clarify, I can't remember exactly what I said in response to this earlier, but just to make sure everyone, knows is on the same page. So Title VI does apply to those services, right? Obviously, they're governed by non-discrimination rules, right? The same as other services. I'm just not entirely clear on how, in terms of like service change specifically, what those rules dictate. In this regard.
Yeah, it's difficult to measure because as for fixed route, we can measure span of hours and route miles and things like that. For access on demand, there's nothing that we can measure. So it's kind of difficult to kind of, I guess, wrap my head around it right now. But once I get clarity from Gabe, I'll reach out to you, Colleen, and I'll provide you with an answer.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions on major service change before we proceed? Okay, awesome. Well, thank y'all. And I would just encourage you, if you haven't filled out that survey, please fill it out. Let us know your thoughts.
Yeah, and in the chat, I see Jamie Lewis. I'm wondering if that's Director Lewis. Also, giving us a reminder that the service change the January service changes take effect this Sunday. All right, thank you, Danny. And so continuing on the proposed policy changes, the second policy change that we are proposing is to adjust the RTD definition of low-income household by increasing the threshold from 150% of the federal poverty level to 200%. So currently, a household is considered low income if its combined income is at or below 150% of the federal poverty level. And the proposed change would raise this threshold to 200%, allowing more households to qualify as low income. So this adjustment is significant because it expands on the inclusion of low-income households in RTD's equity analyses for service and fare changes, and it ensures a broader and more comprehensive evaluation of equity impacts. And to the right here, we have a graphic illustrating the household size and the combined income required to be considered low income. For example, under the current 150% threshold, a household is a household of four earning 46,800 or less would be captured in our analyses as low income. And with the proposed change increase to 200%, households earning up to 62,400 would now be included in our analyses. So this change means that we, RTD, can see a fuller picture of the community's needs and ensure that services and policies are equitable for a broader range of people. Next slide, please. So to give you another visual and a better idea of the number of households that would be considered by increasing the threshold, if we focus our attention on the blue bar representing Denver County, under the current policy, roughly 20,000 families would be considered low income and be captured in our analyses. Under the proposed policy, this number would increase to roughly 30,000. So essentially more low income families are being considered when we make changes to our services. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to recap, we are proposing to consider households as low income if they earn up to 200% or less of the federal poverty level, which is currently set at 150%. Are there any questions on any of these proposed changes?
This is Jamie. I was just going to say that would be your LIVE program.
Yeah, so the LIVE program is actually separate from the proposed policies. The LIVE program actually has a threshold at 250%.
Okay.
This is referring to our equity analysis, essentially, of the BIPOC populations that are captured within our equity analyses. So at this time, I'd like to invite you to provide some feedback on this proposed change. You can scan the QR code, and then we'll also drop the link in the chat. It's a two-question survey, whether you agree or disagree with this proposed change. I'll pause here for a little bit. All right, let's go ahead and continue. Next slide, please. So the final policy change we are proposing focuses on defining our fair equity policy to clarify when a fair equity analysis is required. So RTD's current policy ensures that fair changes do not disproportionately burden BIPOC or low-income riders compared to the overall ridership. Specifically, any fair price change or averages of multiple fair changes must not negatively impact these groups by more than 5%. In addition to fair pricing, the policy also addresses fair payment methods. For example, if payment methods such as passes, electronic payments, vending machines, or online options are changed or discontinued, RTD conducts an equity analysis to assess how these changes may affect riders' access to fair options. Next slide, please. So the proposed policy builds on this foundation by providing a clear and more comprehensive definition of what constitutes a fair change. It expands the scope to include adjustments in fare prices, types of fare medium, like cash or electronic payments, fare products like day or monthly passes, and different fare levels for example, standard versus airport pricing, and then customer categories such as senior or youth. And access to ticket vending machines as well. So by defining fare changes more thoroughly, we propose the proposed addition ensures clarity when identifying when an equity analysis is necessary. And so the goal of this refinement is to clearly establish when an equity analysis is required, and to ensure that changes to fare or payment methods do not disproportionately impact BIPOC or low-income populations. Next slide, please. Okay, so in essence, we are building the current policy and clearly defining when a fair equity analysis is required. Do we have any questions with changes to this policy? Andrea?
How does this affect the unbanked population? I know that's a strange question, but it seems that in Denver area, there are a lot of people without bank accounts, without charge cards. How do we handle them? Do the machines still take cash? I haven't used one in a long time.
Yes, Danny, you have a little bit more information. I'll tag you into that. So essentially the proposed policy will consider the people that are unbanked, and that goes into electronic and cash payment methods. Danny, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, so I can provide some information. I know that RTD is in the process of updating our ticket vending machines. I'm not entirely clear on the details for when those will be installed, but it's very important to our team that the ability to pay with cash is present. So that is captured in past like fair equity analyses that we have done. You know, similar to other transit agencies around the country, there has been discussion in RTD about moving to a cash-free system, and we very explicitly were like, no, it's not a great idea, right? Let the
Excellent.
system work. Right, exactly. So that is absolutely a consideration in the fair equity analyses that we conduct.
Good, good.
I'll also pause here just to give you some time to provide feedback on this, whether you agree or disagree with the proposed policy changes. I'll give it about 40 seconds. And we'll also drop the link in the chat. You can scan the QR code as well.
And even if your feedback is, you know, if it's just a few words like, I agree, or I think this is great, it's still extremely useful for us. So even if you know, don't feel like your feedback is, you know, super fleshed out, robust, whatever, we want everything that you have to say and everything that you think. So please do participate.
All right, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so let's walk through the timeline and what to expect next. We began this work back in July, proposing and drafting the policy changes to the 2025 Title VI program update. Our current stage in orange, December 2024 to January 2025, is where we will be attempting to collect public comment, hence the presentation today. We will then take the feedback and incorporate it into the draft program in March. The full program update will be up for public comment then. And we will finalize the program update in May. And at the end of May, we'll go ahead and submit the program update to the FTA. We'll also post the final version on our website. Next slide, please. Okay, I think that concludes our entire presentation. We can go ahead and take any questions now. Andrea?
I can't be the only one here that has any questions or statements, but it sounds like RTD is moving in a very positive direction. And I know that, you know, it's the feds prompting some of this, but it really does help a lot of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate the comment.
That's very kind of you. One thing I want to note is that the FTA's guidance on Title VI actually hasn't been updated since 2012. So a lot of this is our initiative as the Civil Rights Department and internal to RTD, you know, trying to do much better to embody inclusivity and equity in what we do.
If I might ask, where do immigrants and particularly non-permanent residents, where do they fit into this whole process?
Sure, I can take that on. So Title VI protects individuals based on race, color, and national origin, and then Colorado state statutes expands the categories of protection. And so newcomer population fall within that category. And I would say at RTD, we are trying to have a fairly robust language access program, for instance, that focuses and prioritizes authentically connecting with the newcomer population to ensure that our services and programs meet their needs, and especially their linguistic needs, right? As Lorna mentioned earlier, we don't want our programs or services, anything to be a barrier to participation. And so our protections based in Title VI apply very much to those populations in multiple ways.
It really concerned me when last year they said 40,000 Venezuelans had ended up in Denver. And I know they didn't all stay here, but that's a huge number of people that need services, even though they're not citizens. I can understand them not getting Social Security, but they need to get to their jobs. So I'm glad to see some of this happening.
Yeah, and to comment specifically on that, at the highest point of the newcomer influx that we were seeing, what was that, about a year and a half ago, we, met internally and intentionally were doing outreach to like Denver Human Services, for example, to ensure that newcomers were aware of their transit resources. So we did education, right? Just sharing about what program services RTD offers, but especially focusing on available discounts and available support, right? If folks need language assistance, for instance, where to go for that help.
That's really good, as long as it's not taking away from our own citizens, which is the other side of the coin, our own citizens who need the help.
Yeah. I think we have time if anyone has one more quick question, and then we'll have to move on. Or if anyone has any others, feel free to type in the chat. But these are great questions. Good. You have very good questions today, Andrea. Any others? Okay, well, if anything else comes up, feel free to type it in the chat, but thank you all for sharing this information. It's been really just helpful and informative, and yeah, if anything comes up, just let us know and we can share it out, but I appreciate it. All right, so I'm gonna pass it to Latoya real quick, who is going to talk about our LCC lunch that's coming up.
I don't think I could follow RTD's lead on their presentation, but I'll definitely come up with some stuff now. So we do have a luncheon that's going to be hosted over at the Ford Warren Library. It's going to be on the 29th this month from 11 to 1. So this is really a good space for all the LCCs to really come in person. I know virtually it can be difficult to build some of those relationships and network. And so we really want to make sure that not only is there a space for that, but also to really get some good updates from each LCC and really talk about what's going on in the neighbor counties, what's working, what's not working, right? Things like that. And so we are wanting to provide a space for that. As well as provide food. So we will have Subway, some subs, chips, desserts, drinks. So please come and enjoy some food and some conversation and networking opportunities and just some really good updates about what's going on, what's ahead for these LCCs and what we really want to make sure we're doing, which is something Andrea spoke on before, is those folks that are falling through the cracks, right? We really want to make sure that we're supporting those populations and working on projects and seeing really things that we can measure our success in with these LCCs. So please come and attend. If you have not RSVP'd already with me, I see a lot of you have, but if you have not, I'm going to drop my email in the chat. Please just email me and let me know, hey, I want to come. I have these many people. I'd love to come with us. And we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you guys so much. Back to you guys.
Thank you, Latoya. So again, if you've been to our meetings before, you know what time it is. It's community update time. So we just want to open up the floor for any kind of events, things that are coming up, any exciting news, anything you want help promoting. You can unmute, raise your hand, type in the chat. So yeah, go ahead and share. That was our community update. So I know everyone's busy planning their 2025 schedule. Yeah, Danny.
Yes, one thing I think folks are probably aware of, but 2024 saw great success with the Transit Assistance Grant Program. It has been reopened and renewed for 2025. So please do apply by the deadline of January 31st if you're an organization who serves clients with immediate needs. I'll pop the page for the tag program in the chat. But yeah, we're super excited that this is happening again and hope this is something we can continue.
Could I add something? I'm not sure if anyone here was involved in the possible immigrant town hall that was going to take place on Saturday, but it has been canceled because the weather was going to be so cold. Just wanted to pass that along.
That's the one that I was attending with you, right,
Yes.
Andrea?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Anything else? I know if you're anything like us, we've been looking at our 2025 and planning events and stuff. So I'm sure there's something.
This was an excellent, excellent program. I appreciated hearing from everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Glad you liked it.
Thank you for always sharing, Andrea. I appreciate you for that.
Kudos where kudos are due.
Thank you. Well, if anything does come up, you can always reach out to us and you can email one of us or our info email, whatever works for you. But if there are no more updates in the meeting today, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Colleen.
All right. As always, we'd like to give a special shout out to our Dr. Mac members. We truly couldn't do what we do without their support. If you haven't gotten your 2025 membership yet, there's still time. We should probably put the link to where they can go and sign up for a membership on the website. Please, someone. And that brings us to the end of our meeting today. Thank you all for attending and learning with us. We look forward to seeing you all at next month's member meeting scheduled for February 4th from 1:30 to 3 p.m. on Zoom. All are welcome to join our member meeting, even if you aren't currently a Dr. Mac member. The registration links for all 2025 meetings can be found on our website. Thanks again, and we'll see you all next month.